You started your journalism career in Broken Hill in the 1960s and had an immediate impact. What actually happened?
Well, Broken Hill was one of the richest cities around the world at the time with its mining, and it was sort of exempt from a lot of New South Wales laws. It was one of the highest sources of revenue for the New South Wales government, and it was a city run by the unions. And among other things, it ended up with 24-hour hotels, SP bookmaking shops in the main street in the suburbs, then brothels, and then ultimately two up schools. In fact, today they've got one legal, but anyway. But then they set up the first American casino type business in Broken Hill. I exposed it in the bulletin called Behind the Barrier, and it created the first official investigation by authorities into police corruption in New South Wales, acknowledged in a report in recent times produced in the New South Wales Parliament, nominating all the inquiries since 1963, and that's what I caused. And so that triggered a situation where I used to do the odd exposés on Broken Hill.
But you learnt pretty quickly in Broken Hill the power, all about power.
Oh, there's no risk on that.
Union power, you were black banned, you couldn't go in a local pub. What else happened?
Oh, I was black banned and whatnot, but weirdly, the unions then put a fine on me. And because everyone had to be a member of the union, you couldn't work in Broken Hill, otherwise women couldn't work, married women and that. But again, from a journalistic point of view, the Journalists Association at that time came out to Broken Hill. They paid my fine, so the unions accepted it, and that they eventually lifted the ban. But no, I was targeted by them from time to time. But I learned a lot at Broken Hill, dealing with power at its most organised. And so when I later went to Sydney, and then I was in Melbourne too, and I've been in Queensland, I had a fairly thing about background knowledge of how to deal with power.
But quite often you were also the source to many journalists on information about organised crime. How did that actually work, and who were you working for? Well,
I would have to say at times more than half of my incoming information went to other journalists. And in fact, to the extent that throughout in the 1980s in particular, I was, as you know, writing as an investigative journalist for The Age in Melbourne, but I was then also engaged by the Sydney Morning Herald, and my role there was really to inform their other investigative journalists, not so much to write for the Herald, although I did, or I'd write for both, but to go to Sydney 2 days a week to inform journalists of not only information, but to give them advice on certain stories to pursue and whatnot.
That's a unique role in Australian journalism, isn't it?
Fairly unique, because some of the big exposés in Australia that led to even inquiries, I often played a part behind the scenes. Sometimes it was acknowledged, it didn't matter to me, but I had a fair part in some pretty notable journalists.
I don't want to push you too much, but were you a conduit, perhaps, between some of the journalists and some of the enforcement authorities? Is that how it worked?
Well, one of the things that my advantage was that when I started to do investigative journalism, it was in the 1960s. A lot of people didn't trust the police, and I tended to be sought out even by police, the honest ones. And then as a result of some of my work and others, they set up crime intelligence units, and that they were duplicated in all states and then became federal. And my main sources for journalism were not ordinary police. They were police intelligence officers and police. And I was a very rare person for them. They didn't generally give it to anyone else. So if there was something very secretive, ought to be revealed in the public interest, those agencies would tend to come to me and get advice on how to release it and whatnot. And I would often release it to other journalists rather than just do it myself.
So you're trusted by the police and trusted by the journalists.
That's it. And so I was the sort of the gateway to release it, and that's sort of gone on even in recent years at times. If they want to do something, I'll pass it on to someone.
Now, we know journalists have got egos, so a lot of the way they wrote up those stories, they didn't say that it came from you. It suggested it came from their own sources. But you could live with that. I can live with it. I didn't ask for acknowledgement, but I must say that in some cases, and I think you really may know this, that some of them, of course, made a point privately to suggest that I'd never given it to them, but at least they were serving the public interest, and I supported them anyway. Apart from your time with journalists, you're also instrumental in setting up royal commissions, commissions of inquiry. How did those come about?
I exposed the fact that organised crime had changed in Australia. It had become modernised. Anyway, in came the organised prostitution with massage parlours and everything. In came SP networks and then the return of the drug trade in the 60s. So that became pretty influential for the future. And in doing that, I was only able to uncover that because I got some very trusted sources in the police. And unlike, say, a police roundsman and whatnot, I was able to make contacts with some honest police, and that set a sort of a basis for a network that continued for decades.
And how did you survive financially? Were you paid by the media organisations?
For much of my career I had been. I worked originally for the Daily and Sunday Telegraphs under the Packer Empire, and then we started the first Royal Commission into organised crime in Australia. It was the Moffat Royal Commission that exposed organised crime in a modern sense and its links with the mafia of the United States. And as a result of threats and all sorts of pressures on me throughout that Royal, I was their first major witness. After the Royal Commission, I decided to take a break and get out of the limelight. Well, I must say that I lived for much of that time with 24-hour guards, armed police living in the house 24 hours a day. My children were young. They grew up most of their life always with police gunmen in the house to protect us against the heavies of organised crime. So after the Moffat Commission period, I went back to my hometown of Broken Hill in Western New South Wales, and I had owned a newspaper there. Then I came back involved again, back in Sydney, and I was funding my own operations and led to future things. But from time to time I either worked for the major papers, the Age, Sydney Morning Herald, but more particularly the Bulletin magazine, and in subsequent years at one stage for the Australian and other papers. And of course some of my articles used to appear all over around the world, particularly in America and Europe, yeah.
And you've been involved in giving evidence or working with quite a number of commissions of inquiry and royal commissions?
Overall, I've been involved in 18 Royal Commission, special commissions of inquiries, and 18 of them. I think about 7 of them were Royal Commissions. I helped start several of them. Sometimes I'd be involved because of my knowledge, but they were quite a big pressure on me. Sometimes I'd be quizzed for days by all sorts of lawyers on behalf of all sorts of crims and police and whatnot to corrupt people, but it was worthwhile.
You're risking your life at times.
Definitely, and of course One of the things is that I got some resentment from some police because I also took a role in advocating for the establishment of Australia for better facilities to pursue organised crime and corruption. It was based on a report I wrote that the first crime commissions were set up in Australia. That was federal. It was the National Crime Authority, which became the Australian Crime Commission, And then in New South Wales, the New South Wales Crime Commission, and in Queensland they set up a crime commission. I wrote a report for the government there. And so I've been involved in the establishment of a lot of those. And in fact, only several years, 2009, I published a book called Fighting Organised Crime, which I gave just my history of setting up these organisations in Australia. Yeah.
Delving into organised crime is quite a risky way to earn a living. Why did you do it, and did you ever feel seriously under threat?
I did feel seriously under threat at times, and that continued from the 70s through to the early 90s. And in fact, I might tell you that, so we had not just federal police protection, that's what we originally had, but one of the things that was really welcoming for me was that I couldn't trust some of the New South Wales police. And Victorian police, the Bureau of Criminal Intelligence, used to hire a plane, fly from Melbourne, land at Bankstown Airport in Sydney, and come and surround my house to protect me. On one occasion, they actually arrested a New South Wales policeman climbing through a window of our house. Anyway, he got away with it later because he said he was just he was acting on a prompt to try and see some of my files to see if they'd been pinched from his operation, which was nonsense, but he got off for that. So we've always had backup. In fact, it's hard to get away from, but I'm away from it now, thankfully.
What about these days, organised crime and corruption? Do you think it's any less than what you found in the earlier days?
No, I think that organised crime today is still very much a national threat. International syndicates are now actually operating in Australia in concert with their bases overseas, and they're behind a lot of the drug imports, which are extraordinarily high in Australia at the moment. And according to the latest estimates by federal authorities, that's the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission, is that the total cost of organised crime in Australia has gone up to $47 billion a year. That's mind-boggling.
And do you think journalists are covering that adequately?
Not currently, no. Some journalists are doing a very good job as investigative journalists, but the organised crime picture, I don't think is getting the work that I used to devote to it, but not just on my own, but along with a series of other journalists who did very good work.
Why is that?
I don't know. I think that it's partly because of authorities have a different approach. I don't think that they're giving as much attention to exposing the reality of some of it, except that they do make a lot of drug seizures, and they get publicity, but I think that to really tackle the heart of organised crime, I think that they're more likely to do it if there's more media pressure.
And why do you think the media isn't paying due attention?
I don't think that they've got access that I was luckily able to get at that time. And see, one of the things that happened early in my career, when I worked for the Telegraph, we started the first report on organised crime in Australia, I was actually forced within the office, within the newspaper of the Daily Telegraph, I wasn't able to associate with the police roundsmen, let alone deal with ordinary police, and had to be done in a special fashion. And today, unfortunately, I don't think there's any journalists who are seeking out those intelligence operatives who could help.
What's the background to the age tapes?
Those tapes were done illegally by the New South Wales Police, and part of the mystery about how I used to know so much was that for many years before we released the age tapes in February 1984, for probably a decade before then, I'd been leaked material from phone taps done by the New South Wales Police, who didn't have the power at those days. They didn't have the legality. The release of the aged tapes followed the use by me of some legal phone taps called Spendthrift. They were by the Federal Police in 1983, and in which they covered all sorts of things, but in particular, those tapes ultimately led to... I briefed journalists on them originally, and then the authorities, federal and state, started to react against them. So I then came out and acknowledged that I had these tapes. The tapes I started to leak particularly were called Spendthrift, and they dealt with federal things, but in particular they covered corruption by a minister of the New South Wales government called Rex Jackson. He was subsequently jailed, and then ultimately after that there was a special commission of inquiry, and I must tell you that ultimately 60 police were charged with corruption charges over those tapes, but the aged tapes dealt with a series of tapes done by New South Wales Police on the Mr Biggs, mainly of organised crime. And in the course of it, as well recorded in Australia, then a High Court Judge, Lionel Murphy, in a former minister, he got unearthed in that and was convicted at one stage, then acquitted of corruption, and died just as the government was setting up a special new inquiry into it. But those tapes covered all aspects of organised crime.
So the age tapes were about over 500 pages of transcript and almost 4,000 taped conversations.
Right.
You got hold of those.
Right.
Went down to the Age.
Yes.
Gave them to Lindsay Murdoch and David Wilson.
That's
and then
right.
spent some time working with them.
I worked with them, and I must pay tribute to them. They did it professionally. Not only they accepted them, but they actually sought to make them to also get some verification that they were authentic. Neville Wran had a meeting of the Parliament of New South Wales. He was the Premier of New South Wales. Got the Parliament to assemble on a Friday, and they went till 4 o'clock on a Saturday morning and passed special legislation which was aimed at having me fined and jailed because they knew I had possession of these tapes. And anyway, when I flew to Melbourne on the Monday morning, and when my wife got home, after dropping me off at the airport, the police commissioner rang, and he was coming out to arrest me, so he missed me. But I then stayed on in Melbourne and helped them as much as I could. And ultimately, after that, I then rejoined the Age's investigation team, which was run then by David Wilson and Lindsay Murdoch, who both did a very good job. And some weird things happen with within police forces. Similarly, sometimes within journalism, I have to say that sometimes when I've had threats on my life, some journalists have done things on behalf of organised crime figures, or corrupt police, from the police rounds type thing. Because I never dealt with normal police, generally.
No. But like what?
No, I dealt with intelligence.
Yeah, but what did the journalists do?
There were some journalists who were known to be crooks in Sydney. In fact, to the extent that they've even got named later about helping Lenny McPherson, the Mr Big of Sydney, and George Freeman, another Mr Big of Sydney, and others in attacking me. And I always remember a book I released on one of the books I released on organised crime. I gave it to a journalist in Sydney, and it was on how the mafia got away with the murder of Donald Mackay and Griffith. And the journalist I trusted the most, Sydney Morning Herald, gave that book to Al Grasby. He was a corrupt former member of ALP in the federal parliament. But anyway, they tried to block the book, so you could never, you're never sure who you could trust.
So after the Age tapes were published, Neville Wran said they were phony. Gareth Evans also attacked them. Yeah. So there was a lot of emphasis on the illegality rather than the content. Yeah. It seems to be a constant ploy to deflect attention from the findings.
they've done that on other occasions too, but in this case in particular, it was amazing because ultimately they were forced to set up a Royal Commission run by a former policeman and a lawyer called Donald Stewart, and he authenticated the tapes totally, right. You know, and even had the police give evidence who done the bugging and whatnot, and so that all became history later.
You've said that criminals often fear journalists more than police. Could you delve into that?
Well, there's no risk on that because when I wrote the first significant historical piece for the Daily Telegraph about organised crime that ultimately caused the Moffat Royal Commission, the first Royal Commission into organised crime, I mentioned the Mr Big of Sydney being behind organised crime taking over registered clubs, and that's a big industry in New South Wales. And anyway, the Mr Big, Lenny McPherson, rang me, and he was trying to be nice at first, but he then threatened me, you know. But he was obviously, a lot of it's been quoted since, but he was more worried about what I was doing, worried about the police, because the police didn't intervene at all at that stage, and that the Royal Commission uncovered the fact that the police were covering up and working with Lenny on something. But subsequent to that, I've had various calls from other organised crime figures, and even when my life was threatened, I picked up on phone taps and that. On 2 occasions, Lenny McPherson actually intervened to stop them doing it because he was fearful of what would happen to my files that I had. He was always fearful I had files that would probably bring them undone, and that was, you know, just one of the things that another criminal did on another occasion. Intervened on a case where I was going to be kidnapped or something. Yeah.
Good Lord. Okay. Were you worried about your family?
We were worried, and my children grew up in a very worrying period because we had the police living in the house all the time. Oh, not all the time, but for many years. And even in recent time, or no, not so recent, some years ago now, when I actually retired, and I moved to a coastal place in New South Wales, and I don't say I never nominate. In all the commissions of inquiry, I've never been able to allow anyone to run my address, right? Anyway, but in this case, I moved there under no idea anyone would know where I was at this stage. Within 2 weeks, I got a call on behalf of Stan the Man Smith. He was probably the second fiercest Mr Big in Sydney, and he just wanted to pass on a message to me. He knew I was back in New South Wales, hoping I wouldn't do anything silly and cause any trouble, and suggested I continue to look after my health and I can go walking each day this way or that one. He knew where I was walking every day just to let me know I was under surveillance, and you know, no, they don't forget.